Hello, and welcome to the National Press Club. I'm Mike Freedman, the 113th president of the National Press Club. I'm the former general manager of CBS Radio Network, now journalist in residence at University of Maryland Global Campus, and executive producer of the public broadcasting series The Kalb Report with journalist Marvin Kalb. World Press Freedom Day was established by the United Nations General Assembly in 1993. Each year since, this early May commemoration has served as a reminder to governments around the world of the need to respect their commitment to press freedom, and as a day of reflection among journalists about issues at the forefront of press freedom as well as professional ethics. Finally, it's a day to pay tribute to those who have lost their lives in the line of duty. This year, journalists around the world are serving a hugely important role with their coverage of the coronavirus crisis. UN Secretary General Antonio Guterres said recently, as the COVID-19 pandemic spreads, it has also given rise to a second pandemic of misinformation, from harmful health advice to wild conspiracy theories. The press provides the antidote, he said, verified, scientific, fact-based news and analysis. Here to join us for a conversation about World Press Freedom Day 2020 are two of America's finest journalists. John Donnelly, senior writer for CQ Roll Call, an award-winning investigative reporter who covers national security and foreign policy issues. John is chair of the Press Freedom Committee of the National Press Club and its Journalism Institute. In addition, he is president of the Military Reporters and Editors Association. Thank you for joining us, John.
Nice to be here.
We also welcome, for the first part of our program, Washington Post Global Opinions writer and CNN contributor Jason Rezaian. From 2012 to 2016, Jason served as the Washington Post correspondent in Tehran. During that time, he spent 544 days unjustly imprisoned by Iranian authorities until his release in January of 2016. Jason, thank you also for joining us.
Thanks, Mike. It's a great pleasure to be here.
Reporters Without Borders World Press Freedom Index shows that the number of countries where journalists are considered safe is on the decline. In the time of coronavirus, the impediments to press freedom threaten to be even greater. As you two consider the most crucial challenges facing journalists in 2020 and what the general public needs to know, what do you see as the most pressing issues right now? And I would include in that equation newsroom layoffs here, threats and violence against reporters, and misinformation. John, let me start with you. Just talk for a few minutes about the big issues that we're confronting as we commemorate this day in 2020.
To my way of looking at it, the biggest task we have is to convince the public, or at least enough of the public, because some people can't be convinced, of the importance of journalism and the role that we have, particularly in democracies, in holding politicians' feet to the fire and in keeping people in power honest. There is a concerted campaign going on, and obviously the White House and the President of the United States is a key player in this, but it's not just them. It's kind of a tried and true formula for people who are trying to manipulate public opinion to kind of shoot the messenger sometimes, and characterize reporters who are, in fact, just doing their best to tell the truth as, fake news and that sort of thing. The problem I'm referring to is not, yes, it's a problem that the President of the United States says these things, but it's, to me, a more fundamental and abiding problem that there are so many people that believe it, that there are so many people that do not fully understand how important it is for reporters to play the role they play in this society. And that's not to say that we aren't often too ideological or that we don't make mistakes, because we have fallen short on both those counts. It's more and more recently, in fact, but especially with the ideological stuff. But the fundamental fact is that most reporters in this country in particular, but I would say even around the world, are just trying to get the story right. And anybody who accuses them of intentionally trying to mislead people that person is himself being, misleading. And I just think the biggest overall challenge is for us to make sure that the public understands why we matter.
Jason, let's talk to you for a few minutes. Anything to add to what John has just said in terms of
Well, Mike,
current challenges?
Sure, I would echo everything that John said, and add to that in democracies around the world, countries that have been reliable democracies, partners in the notion of a free and vibrant press, we see more and more a tightening, a clamping down on the flow of information. Places like India, Brazil, Mexico. These are places where there had been a very active and critical press for a very long time, and now we see authoritarian type leaders using the moment, using the pandemic as an impetus to enact emergency measures that we don't know if and when will be lifted. And this is a new facet of the world that we're living in. And I think that that John is precisely correct, that the work that we do as journalists is to inform publics and to hold our politicians to account. If the only or best defense that a politician who, by definition, especially in this country, has access to great platforms and the ability to communicate a message, if their only response is that we're not telling the truth, but then can't back it up with any sort of facts or verifiable information, it would appear that those sorts of accusations are pretty flimsy. But ultimately, as we see more and more in this country and other countries, people are questioning the veracity of the stories that we tell, and that's something that we really need to keep a close eye on, because at the newspaper I work at, and so many others around the country, there is a deep commitment to not only telling the truth, but to amending mistakes when we make them. And this is part and parcel of our work as journalists. We're not going to be perfect 100% of the time, but when we are not perfect, we take responsibility for that. And I just wish that more people would see the work that we're doing for what it is, as a public service.
Let me go back to what you said about emergency orders, particularly with regard to the coronavirus crisis. There are certain emergency orders which have been helpful, but it sounds like certain governments can and perhaps will take license with that to impose other emergency orders that may or may not be lifted ever.
We saw in India a few weeks ago that Prime Minister Modi tried to compel the Supreme Court of that country to force journalists, force news organizations to only publish the government line on how they were handling the coronavirus and not question it at all. Fortunately, the highest court in India declined to do that, but they did say that newspapers and other news agencies had a responsibility to include the government line, even if it was to misinform the people. You look to Hungary, where Viktor Orban, the prime minister there, has been for years grabbing power bit by bit, and now seemingly has endless power in that country. This does not bode well for our short or long-term future. Those of us who care about democracy and want to see it flourish around the land. I think here in the United States, we have a tendency to be very protective of our rights to expression, as we should be. I think that by and large, despite our declining standing in various press freedom indices, I don't think we're going to lose that right anytime soon, and I hope never. But it could get a lot worse here if we take this for granted.
In your role as Washington Post global opinions writer, how often do you focus in on this, and what else do you touch on in that role?
Look, Mike, I obviously had a very strange experience being imprisoned in Iran. But before that, I'd spent a lot of time working and living in that society. So I continue to write about Iran, probably as much as anybody in Washington. But I also write quite a bit about press freedom issues. I never assumed or expected that I would become sort of a poster child for this issue. And whether I wanted that or not is irrelevant. Now that I have it, I have to do everything I can to stand up for colleagues wherever they are in the world. If they're being cracked down upon, silenced, killed, I take it as a sort of a responsibility to do that. And I end up writing about it quite a bit. I had a column out this morning about World Press Freedom Day that will be included in our Washington Post Press Freedom newsletter, which comes out the first Monday of every month. If you're not subscribing to that, it's free. I urge everybody who cares about this issue to subscribe. You'll get the up-to-date news about what press freedom organizations, including the National Press Club, are doing in this fight globally. But this is an important issue that I'll be writing and talking about for the rest of my life.
Jason, as you look back on your experience today, 4 years later, what are your takeaways that you can share, and have they changed over the course of the 4 years?
Look, I was the recipient of a lot of support, not only from my newspaper, the Washington Post, but from the community of journalists and news organizations here in the U.S. and around the world. I understood that in one of these situations where someone is unjustly detained, wherever they are in the world, if that is allowed to remain silent, the likelihood of one ever finding their freedom diminishes exponentially. So I am consistently looking for opportunities to shine a light on instances of injustice, because if you don't, injustice will prevail and descend further across the world. And I think, as much as I consider myself a patriot and I love this country, it's given me an opportunity, now that I live here in the U.S. Capitol for the first time in my life, to see the inner workings sort of up close and personal. And it's made me feel an even greater responsibility to write and talk about things that are happening right here in our own backyard.
How do we best protect our journalists that are working overseas and that are in repressed countries?
Well, I mean, I think that one thing that we need to look to do in the future, and there's no easy answer for this, but to find a universal way to create an index of journalists who are working for independent news organizations. Oftentimes you will hear a journalist being called out as a spy or terrorist or some other sort of subversive agent. We should be able to do away with those monikers, and no journalist should have to be subjected to that kind of attack on their character, on their person, anywhere in the world. But tons of work still needs to be done to see that happen. In the meantime, I think the thing that I always tell people, whether we're talking about journalists here in the United States or anywhere in the world, everybody should be subscribing to newspapers. I urge everyone to subscribe to a national paper. I would suggest the Washington Post. I know there are other options as well, but also a local paper. And I think that in doing so and investing in journalism is one of the most important ways that we can protect and promote the values and the health of journalism generally.
Do you believe that public pressure on regimes such as the one in Iran makes a difference?
Certainly. If I follow, in addition to following press freedom issues, I follow hostage cases very closely. And there's a big difference between a hostage taking if it is carried out by a terrorist organization or by a foreign government. And in the case of foreign governments, when they take a U.S. or other foreign national hostage, I think public pressure is one of the only things that works not to necessarily get those regimes like the one in Iran to do the right thing, but to get the home country, in my case, the U.S. government, involved, and to create enough pressure that there's public opinion on the side of the person that's being held. Look, when I was put on trial in a revolutionary court in Iran, I understood that that was not a case that I was going to win. The case that I had to win was the case of American public opinion, and I think I won that one pretty early.
You mentioned some good guidance for the general public to support journalism, to subscribe to those news organizations' publications online, in print, however you might want to receive them in order to show support. What would your message be for the journalists on the front lines today?
Look, I think that those of us who are used to working in remote corners of the world, far from our newsrooms, have a tendency to feel as though we're very removed from what's going on at home base. I learned that couldn't have been further from the truth. And I wish that in the years that I was working for the Post, I had more of a connection with my colleagues in the newsroom. I would have understood then, when I was taken into custody, that they had my back. And I think that journalists working on the front lines really don't realize the amount of respect, admiration, and care that their colleagues back in the home newsroom have for them. And I think it's probably not something that they hear very often, but they should reach out and form those types of relationships. Look, we're all doing it now. We're able to communicate with each other through the screens of our computers. It's as easy as that to connect with people these days. And I think there's a lot of benefit to be had from those kinds of connections between foreign correspondents and their desks.
Thank you. Jason Rezaian, we appreciate your taking time to join us today, and we want to wish you and your family all the best.
Likewise. Thanks so much. You guys have a great afternoon, and a happy, healthy World Press Freedom Day to everyone.
Thank you very much, Jason. John Donnelly, we're going to continue with you, and I wonder if you could talk with us for a little bit about some of the major press freedom cases that are still sitting out there unresolved.
Well, one of the cases that we at the National Press Club have been riding pretty hard for a long time now, for too long actually, is a case of Austin Tice, who is the Texan who was a Georgetown student and a Marine who was taken into custody in Syria in 2012. August will be 8 years. He is understood to be alive, and we've been working closely with his family for a while, trying to secure his release. We had a good outcome, or at least a good event in March when President Trump mentioned Austin Tice's case when he was speaking to reporters, and said that they're working hard on it. His national security advisor is known to be personally involved in the case, so we're hopeful. But Austin Tice has now been in prison, detained for longer than any other American journalist has ever been detained, and it's just outrageous. And we've been doing a number of things. Last year, for example, we had what we called a night out for Austin Tice, where we solicited restaurants around the country to have a special night where they where they donated part of their proceeds from that evening to increase the reward money for information leading to Tice's release. We did we organized a campaign on Capitol Hill where scores of members of Congress joined in a letter to the president urging him to do his utmost on this case. So we have really been shining a spotlight on Austin Tice's case, but he's not alone. We were very active in Jason Rezaian's case also, and we're so thrilled to see him back. But there are so many different cases. I'll mention a couple more if you don't mind.
Please.
There's two in particular that jump out at me. One is Mahmoud Hussein Goma, who is an Al Jazeera producer who has been detained in Egypt since 2016. And he had done a film for Al Jazeera on conscription in the Egyptian military, and he offended the powers that be there, and has been in jail for that long, for roughly 4 years. And it's interesting that the charge against him was false news, which has a little bit of an echo, doesn't it? And it points out how despots around the world are thrilled to appropriate the rhetoric of Donald Trump against reporters. When the United States does it, it's something they can point to and say, see, even the United States president believes that there's such a thing as fake news. So it's literally the charge against Mahmoud Hussein Goma. And we call here, as we have consistently, for the Egyptian government and the Egyptian authorities to release him. Another case that I want to bring up is that of Asif Sultan. Asif Sultan was a 2019 winner of one of our Press Club Press Freedom Awards. We call it the John Bhushan Press Freedom Award, which we give annually to a U.S. recipient and to a foreign recipient. And last year he was the foreign recipient. He is still in jail. He was imprisoned in August 2018 for stories that he wrote in Indian Kashmir for a paper called, I believe, the Kashmir Narrator. And the allegation was that he was writing about militants. The allegation was that he was helping militants. But all independent observers have found that this is just a fraudulent charge. And so we call for his release, Asif Sultan, in Kashmir. And the list goes on. According to the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is one of the leading advocacy groups that monitors this sort of thing, there are more than 250 reporters in jail around the world, more than 250 reporters in prison. And 6 have been killed in this year. 64 are missing at last count. So this is a global scourge. And we try to highlight individual cases, but there are always too many for us to mention. But as Jason said, it's really important for people to continually tweet about and write about and speak about these reporters who are persecuted, because it does matter. It matters that the world remembers them.
To our viewers and our listeners, we're speaking with John Donnelly, senior writer for CQ Roll Call, who is chair of the Press Freedom Committee of the National Press Club and its Journalism Institute, and also president of the Military Reporters and Editors Association. And we are discussing World Press Freedom Day 2020 and all the issues that are packed into this commemoration. John, in the midst of the coronavirus crisis, as we've said many times here at the National Press Club, and you have alluded to it a couple of times already in our conversation, our colleagues on the front lines are proving every hour of every day why journalism matters right now. At the same time, and you alluded to this too, journalists in our own country are being berated on a daily basis by no less than the President of the United States, and long-respected journalistic organizations are being dismissed as fake news. When you peel back the top layer of this, some of which is clearly for show, is this different than the relationships between journalists and our government leaders than you've seen in the past? Are we experiencing something new, or is this more of the same?
I think it's definitely new, at least in my lifetime, and from everything I read, it's unprecedented. And what I'm talking about is the rhetoric coming from the President of the United States in particular. As I said, he's not alone in the United States, and he's not alone in the world in trashing reporters. But none of us alive today have ever seen a President of the United States go after credible news organizations in the way that he has, on a consistent basis. And it really is transparently an attempt to undermine the public's belief in, or as much of the public as possible, their belief in these news organizations. And the Marty Baron, the executive editor of the Washington Post, had an interesting observation in some remarks he made at the press club, in fact, a few months back, where he said that this is part of a campaign to impugn the credibility of impartial, neutral arbiters of fact across the board. And reporters are just one of them. Judges are another. Scientists are another. There is a campaign underway, and the reason for it is fairly obvious. It's to get people to believe the leader, in this case, Donald Trump, instead of one's lying eyes, instead of the facts as presented. And so you asked if it's there's a precedent for it. There's none that I can think of in terms of, from the highest levels of the government, a concerted campaign against the press. One can hope that it's temporary, but as I said at the outset, the fact that so many Americans are falling for this suggests to me that it may have some staying power, I regret to say, and I hope I'm wrong. But we'll see, because if Trump succeeds in undermining the credibility of the press, other politicians will take note, and they will do the same. So I'm not hopeful on that score with regard to this particular president, of course, but even the long-term prospects.
And we're seeing it spread across our country, and we certainly see more than hints of this around the world, where other leaders are taking their cues, as many have done for 2 centuries from the President of the United States, right?
Right. Well, for example, I mentioned the case of, and I'll repeat his name again because it needs to stay out there, Mahmoud Hussein Goma of Al Jazeera in Egypt. The actual charge is false news. They didn't say fake news, but they said false news. And you're seeing this over and over again across the world, from Mexico to Azerbaijan. You're seeing it. And yeah, it is, he's provided comfort for dictators. You're seeing it here, even in the United States. Because we've talked mainly about cases abroad, I'll bring up another case or two from this country. One of our award winners in 2019, in addition to Asif Sultan from Kashmir, whom I mentioned, was a woman named Mackenzie Mays, who was a reporter at the time for the Fresno Bee in California. And she did a story about a company that held a party on a boat where there was allegedly drug use and prostitution. And the company is a wine company that's partly owned by Devin Nunes, the congressman from California. Well, the story was written in 2018. She sought comment from Nunes. He didn't comment from the story. He never sought a correction. But then subsequently, he went after Mackenzie Mays personally. Online, and he even put together, I think it was a 30-something page mailer against the Fresno Bee and against her in particular. And she also drew a similar reaction from a school board member from a story that she did. Not because she did the story wrong, I want to emphasize. The stories were accurate. She sought comment from the people who were affected by it. But these people conducted an online campaign. In the case of the school board chief, he encouraged people to show up at her house and threaten her. We wanted to highlight her case by giving her one of our Bhushan awards last year because of a couple reasons. One is the significance of local journalism, which is increasingly embattled because of economic reasons. And the work that they do is so critically important. But two, because we're seeing more and more of this kind of online targeted harassment of journalists. And a lot of it is against women journalists, like Mackenzie Mays. And so I bring it up because it exemplifies how you have a different kind of atmosphere today than you have at least in our lifetimes previously.
You mentioned Marty Baron before, who is among the most measured and ethical journalists that most of us have ever met. And in response to the president, he has said many times and said at the press club, along with the passage that you cited before, we're not at war, we're at work. Does it sometimes feel right now like we're at war these days?
Boy, that's an interesting observation that he made, and I understand totally where he's coming from. And I think what he meant by that is, journalists, individual journalists and editors and reporters and especially can't get into a pissing match with the President of the United States, because if we do, it will, there's a risk that it will solidify and bolster the president's contention that we are against him, which is a false narrative, that we're against the president or we're against his policies and we're all liberal. The reality is completely different. The press, even though, as I pointed out, we make mistakes, and sometimes there are two ideological news organizations. As a rule, the press is just telling the truth, or seeking to do the best they can to tell the truth. Okay, I think where Marty Baron was coming from was, we can't contribute to this idea that we are against Donald Trump by getting in this ongoing argument with him. I get that. However, I think especially for news organizations like the National Press Club or the Committee to Protect Journalists, Reporters Committee for Freedom Press, or even top executives of news organizations, I think they do have a duty to speak out. First of all, when press freedom is threatened, when access and transparency are threatened. So we have a duty to speak out against that stuff, and also a duty to help to educate the public about the role of the press in society and the important function that we play in the democracy. So, because if we don't say it, if we don't stand up for ourselves, I'm afraid nobody else will. So there's a fine sort of balance there, where we don't want to appear to be engaging in some sort of ideological struggle or partisan spat with the president. On the other hand, we have to stand up for ourselves and for our role in society. I think we're doing a pretty good job at striking that balance. We won't please everybody. We won't convince everybody. We just need to accept that. But hopefully there will be enough Americans who will understand the importance of a free press, and hopefully their numbers will grow.
And walking that line is tricky. There are some, including Washington Post media critic Margaret Sullivan, who have said that reporters are playing right into what the president wants by giving his criticism more attention than it deserves, repeating the negatives over and over, and thereby reinforcing them. That's a tough issue to deal with. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, whether it's giving airtime to his criticisms of the press, or giving airtime to his false statements, or just to his theatrics, as opposed to the substance of his policies, there is definitely a risk that we go too far in that direction. However, he is the president of the United States. And so when he says that a reporter is fake news, it's news. It still needs to be covered. So we're kind of learning on the fly how to do this. I think, one of the questions, for example, has been whether to cover live the president's daily press conferences on the coronavirus, because it's just sort of a stream of consciousness of, false information. And a lot of these organizations, well, some of these organizations have decided not to cover it live, or to cover less of it live. And so I get why they would want to do that, because you're not doing if your job is to educate the public, and you're just allowing the president an unfiltered podium to spread misinformation, you're not educating the public. You need to be able to say what the president said, sure, but you should be able to also explain when it's false, how it's false, and that sort of thing. So yeah, these are all difficult questions, and we're sort of learning them as we go.
Is there a tipping point beyond which there won't be a return from the damage done here? And might we be approaching it, or is it conceivable that we've already hit it?
Well, as I said in the outset, I'm fairly pessimistic, just because of the extent to which I see people buying into false information and criticism of the press. But I believe it's probably a cyclical thing. I don't think it's like I don't know that there's necessarily a tipping point that we can't recover from. I think these things are going to go in cycles, but I don't know. I think that our education system has a huge responsibility here to teach our children what the press is and why we matter, and to teach our children other important facets of our government, because I don't think enough people really understand it. And so if that continues to be a problem, then that will be a breeding ground for misunderstanding of what we do, and people will be more likely to buy lies, basically. So I wish I could be more optimistic. I don't know that I don't know that we're in a territory that we'll never get out of, but we got a big problem. And we haven't even touched on the economic element here. The news industry is in big trouble. Since in the last 15 years, I believe it's 1 out of 5 papers has closed, and something like half the journalists, we've lost something like half the journalists in this country, because of the declining business model of news organizations. So that's a key part of the whole issue. You've got parts of the country where they don't have any news about their local elected officials, and so that's a huge part of it. We got to do something to fix that too.
Let's talk about the technology and the role of technology here. We obviously have more information at our fingertips today than ever before in our history. Yet, in a new world, government leaders can bypass the media, the traditional journalist, and talk directly to millions of people in an unfiltered manner. And we all have to ultimately ask, whom do you trust? Do you find, John, that when it matters most, that government leaders still need to turn to the traditional press? Certainly seems to be the case when they're in trouble. What about overall?
Yeah, I think even overall they do. Even President Trump, despite his criticism of so many credible news organizations, will do interviews with them. Now, fewer and fewer of them, I think, especially since the coronavirus hit. He has done pretty much nothing except Fox News interviews. Maybe I've missed 1 or 2 recently, but there was a long stretch there where he only went to friendly news outlets. So it's definitely something to keep an eye on.
How do we as journalists get beyond preaching to the choir? We're conducting this conversation virtually at the National Press Club. This will appear on the National Press Club's website. We hope that it reaches a wider audience of the general public around the country through television, through radio, through various digital platforms. There are, and you pointed it out at the beginning, there are people that don't have to have this explained to them, and there are other people who don't want to hear it. How do we get beyond preaching to the choir here?
Yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, just like you were talking about the technology, the President of the United States can tweet and go around reporters. We can do that too, right? And we need to take full advantage of all the modern communications means and get our message out in ways like this and others. It's a hard problem. But obviously we got to keep at it. But yeah, you're right. We do have to avoid preaching to the choir. And I don't know. I mean, some kind of public information campaign, perhaps, making ourselves available. I talked about education. I mean, in some ways we may have lost the adults, or a lot of them, but it may not be too late to catch some of the kids. So I feel like we might be able to play a role in making ourselves available in schools around the country to let students learn firsthand what it is that we do, so that they see that we're human beings and that we're interested in facts, and that we are, whatever our personal opinions, we're able to set those aside as much as humanly possible when we produce a story. So I think that firsthand contact with people could be promising.
And of course, you're touching on news literacy, and perhaps we've taken for granted that Americans and people around the world actually do understand what journalism is and the role of journalists, and that likely has eroded over the course of time. And now, much as the newspaper world was hit with the digital world and had to scramble, perhaps journalists themselves are in a position of scrambling now to help people better understand exactly what it is we do, and it goes beyond that now to I would think the realm of not just why journalism matters, but why truth matters, and why people need to have credible, accurate, fair information, which leads us to a larger topic, which is our democracy and freedom itself. Talk about the relationship between press freedom and our democracy.
Well, I mean, to you and I, it's plain and simple, but maybe not a lot of people understand that, the press is sometimes called the fourth estate. You got the legislative, the executive, the judicial branches of government, and the press as the fourth sort of unofficial branch of government. And the role is to provide information, unbiased, nonpartisan information. Everybody has some kind of axe to grind, whether it's political power, money. Most people in the public sphere have an interest, and the press, okay, we sometimes have an interest in things like conflict, that sells more papers, but basically we don't have a dog in the fight. And so we're interested in just telling the public, the general public, what they need to know about how the society is functioning. And because the public in a democracy runs the country, it's supposed to through its representatives. And so if the public, meaning the voters and the lawmakers, don't have access to accurate, fair, complete information, they can't make smart decisions. And that's basically what it boils down to. So that's the relationship between press freedom and freedom. And to the degree that the public and its lawmakers operate in darkness, where they don't understand or they misunderstand or they don't know what's happening, to that degree they are less able to effectively govern themselves. So that's the fundamental relationship.
Let's go back to local journalism. You touched on this before, and the fact that we're losing a lot of local coverage around the country. Are there entities that are filling the voids in certain parts of the country? Are there any glimmers of hope out there?
Yeah, there are, and I'm remiss because I'm gonna forget the names of some of the organizations, but they're out there. They have sort of like a Peace Corps for reporters. We're out in places like Appalachia, just all across the country, where they have what they call these news deserts, where their local paper has closed and they need somebody to cover the local scene, the school board, the city council, the mayor's office, the police. You think about, so there are efforts out there, but it seems a little bit like swimming against a riptide. There are economic forces at play here that just can't be. We're not going to go back to where we were. We're going to have to find some new ways to cover it. And I'm not an expert on what all those are, but it's just a shame that it's happened. And I know in Washington, we've also lost so many of our what we call regional reporters. People who work for publications like the St. Louis Post-Dispatch or the Cleveland Plain Dealer, or even smaller papers. They had reporters and editors in Washington. They had bureaus. Maybe it was just one person, but they had somebody here keeping an eye on the delegations and in Congress, among other things happening in Washington. And to the degree, and we've lost hundreds of those reporters, and so there are things that lawmakers from those states are getting away with that we don't know about today because of that. I'm convinced of it. So I'm sorry, I'm not like that good with solutions, but I know there are people who are out there who are working on ways to make a dent in this, and I'm not sure exactly what the answer is, but I do know it's a problem, and it's one that we need to really work on.
Well, a lot of us believe that the first steps in finding a solution is recognizing the problem and helping other people understand what the problem is, and you're certainly doing a very eloquent job of that. Let's talk about an entity like the Associated Press and some of the wire services around the country. These are the unsung heroes oftentimes of journalism, because they are relatively anonymous. They come as close as humanly possible to the original role of a scribe, somebody who gathers information in one location and sorts it and then reports it to other locations. And oftentimes that's not done for the glory. It's done for the purity of the process and the product. And we do still have a foundational entity like the Associated Press in this country and around the world, and there are Reuters and AFP and other terrific news organizations. Offer your thoughts about the role they play, especially to those people that are listening and watching who may just not know much about them.
Yeah, well, the wire services, they, like Associated Press, for example, newspapers around the country will subscribe to or pay a fee or whatever they call it to have access to their journalism. And so a reporter for the AP can write a story about something happening in the Pentagon, for example, that gets picked up all over the place in publications great and small, not just print, but also broadcast outlets. And so what they write, what you hear an announcer say, for example, on your local newscast or on CNN or elsewhere, often it'll be verbatim from a wire service story, or if not verbatim, the fact that something happened is confirmed by them. The Associated Press also has traditionally been the go-to source for election results. You may see Wolf Blitzer announce it on CNN, but it probably was confirmed first by the Associated Press. I would add Bloomberg in there too as another example of a wire service, primarily in the financial realm. But these are global organizations, but they're hit. They're being hit too. But they have traditionally been great sources of information. I mean, I think of the AP as, I read it every day. There's an app on my phone, the AP News app, and I consider it, it's almost like the journalism is like a pane of glass. You barely notice the writers, you barely notice the craft, you just notice what they're talking about. They write in clear, lucid, concise sentences. They're not partisan. But they're not afraid to say this is true, this is false. And so it's just a tremendous source.
And I asked the question as a very proud former managing editor of United Press International, which is a wire service that few people remember anymore. It doesn't take long for it still exists in a much smaller form, but at one time, of course, it was a global competitor to the Associated Press. John, as we wrap up and we look at World Press Freedom Day 2020, in addition to the fight to free the journalists that are being held captive around the world, and help spread the word to the general public about the important role that journalists and journalism play in our democracy. Are there other issues? Are there court cases? Are there things that you foresee on the horizon that we should be looking out for in the coming year? We're coming up on a presidential election. We're in the midst of this coronavirus crisis. I'm just wondering if there are other things that you may see on the horizon here that we should all be on the lookout for in terms of world press freedom.
Well, of course, there are always, individual cases that we are monitoring. I haven't yet mentioned Emilio Gutierrez Soto, a Mexican journalist who the Press Club has been advocating on behalf of. He first came to this country in, I think it was 2008. And he has been fighting a battle in court since then, on and off in court, on and off in prison. He's now in Michigan, while he awaits a pending appeal of an order to expel him from the country. This is a journalist whose life was threatened in Mexico, who came to the United States as a beacon of freedom of liberty, and yet he can't get the freedom he is seeking in the land of the free and the home of the brave. So there's always cases like that we're keeping an eye on. There's court cases we monitor all the time. There's people doing frivolous defamation lawsuits against news organizations. That's a big problem. So there are always things like that we're keeping an eye on. But I think the big issues are the ones we've talked about in terms of the threat from the top of the U.S. government to one of the pillars of our democracy. And I do think that in the midst of this pandemic, and oh, by the way, this is probably not going to be the last pandemic that we face, according to experts. Whenever you have a crisis like this, you're going to have people, not just in this country, but around the world, that are trying to exploit it in order to get the stories they want out. Okay. And so we have to keep an eye on that. But at a time like this, it's ever more important what we do, because, there's a premium on factual, fair, complete information. And if it doesn't get out, lives can be affected. and or if misinformation gets out, it can affect lives. And so again, like I talked about, there are people who have moneyed interest or political interest to say, for example, we don't have to shelter anymore. We can reopen the economy. Don't worry, everything will be fine. If that's not true, we're going to be the ones to tell you that. And so our role is absolutely critical in the months ahead, in the years ahead, and we look forward to performing it.
And I'll ask you the same two questions I asked to Jason Rezaian during the time he joined us. What would your message be to our colleagues that are out there on the front lines today, every day?
The journalists who are overseas, you mean?
Journalists that are overseas, the foreign correspondents, the folks that are covering the coronavirus crisis, and even those that are in the White House every day.
Well, my message would be keep at it. Keep doing what you're doing. What you're doing is right. What you're doing matters. It sometimes can be drudgery. It's not always fun and glamorous, but what you're doing is important. And enough Americans, maybe not as many as we'd like, but there are still plenty of Americans who appreciate it. And we certainly do at the National Press Club because it is a critical function in our democracy.
And one last time, what would you say to the general public that's listening and watching?
I would say pay attention, be careful, be wary of politicians on the left, the right, the middle, any part of the political spectrum who tell you that reporters in general are wrong or fake news, or that most of the mainstream major news organizations like the Washington Post and the New York Times and USA Today and CNN, that they are fake news, because they're not. And you need to be very wary of the motives of these people. And so that's all I would say, is just consider the source and look for yourself. Don't believe what you hear from people who have a vested interest.
John, as a token of our appreciation, you may have some of these. We have for you, as we do for Jason Rezaian, our National Press Club coffee mug with the hope that journalists everywhere can soon share a cup of coffee without fear of reprisal for doing their jobs. And next year on World Press Freedom Day, we hope to present Austin Tice and other captive journalists their mugs in person here at the National Press Club. Thank you for joining us.
Amen. Thank you so much.
You bet. Our thanks to the National Press Club production team that made this program possible. And to all we say, stay well, stay safe, and please join in the fight to protect and defend press freedom, which is a cherished cornerstone of our democracy for all of us. Have a good day. Thank you.